Hi, this is Professor Shar Edelin, and this is a review of the Chapter 7 PowerPoint slides that we will be discussing this week, week 4, in our Constitutional Law Principles and Practice class. As you know, we've already just done the midterm, so chapters 1 through 6 gave us a great foundation about the Constitution, where it was derived from, why we have certain words in there and certain phrases in there, the colonist mindset, and most importantly, some of the underpinnings and foundational issues surrounding the Constitution. Now we get into the nitty-gritty of the Constitution. Now we get into how it has actually been applied. It's one thing to talk about what the colonists thought it should do. It's another thing to talk about what the Constitution is actually doing, or how we're actually interpreting the Constitution. As you can imagine, some of the most important cases that we've dealt with regard to the Constitution are civil rights cases. And civil rights not only based on race, but based on gender, based on occupation. There have been a lot of issues that have come up over time regarding civil rights and liberties. And in this country, as we've talked about before, civil rights and liberties are really the foundation, the most important rights that we have, I would argue. Again, as this slide states, it is unique to the United States that we believe that all citizens have certain fundamental rights and freedoms. We believe that everyone has them. The right to pursue to happiness, the right to be free of persecution, all of those things are important to us. For example, and I've just outlined 3 that came to my mind first, actually. The right to file a writ of habeas corpus. We see that now in a more modern context, usually when a criminal defendant has used all of his or her state remedies and he or she wants the federal court to review it, then they can file a writ of habeas corpus. It technically means that the jailer must bring the imprisoned person to court, and that stems from the past where in England the English were persecuting the colonists, and they would put them in jail first and ask questions later. We don't really have that issue now, but however, you still have the right to file a writ of habeas corpus to require a federal court review your state issue. There are no bills of attainder. Basically, that means that you punish someone, you put them in jail without a trial or sentencing. However, we will see this as it comes up in later chapters. There's an argument that the U.S. Patriot Act has actually revisited or revived the Bill of Attainder. Many of those citizens, they're not citizens, many of those persons in Guantanamo Bay have not had a trial or sentencing. They're beginning to have the trials now, but they sat there in Guantanamo for years without any due process. The issue becomes, do they get due process even though they're not citizens? And I think that has been the linchpin, that has been the reasoning all these times, that all these years, that no one has been forcing the issue. However, in this country, whether or not you're a citizen, if you are in our jails or if you are in our possession in some way, somehow, you are entitled to due process. And that was one of the reasons why the Guantanamo trials began last year and have been going on since then. But remember, many of those people were captured in 2011. They sat a long time with no access to lawyers or our trial courts. There are also no ex post facto laws. As our text outlines, the Daubert v. Florida case is a failed example of someone trying to assert the no ex post facto law. Mr. Daubert committed several murders in the early 70s. In the mid to late 70s, the United States, he committed the murders and was convicted and was sentenced to death. In the mid to late 80s, the death penalty was I don't want to say abolished because it's actually been revived, but there was a moratorium on the death penalty. Mr. Daubert went back to court to say, well, hey, you know, my conviction was invalid because you are convicting me of a law that was not valid during that time period. The court went back to say, well, Mr. Daubert, nice try, but not true. Because the law was enacted while you were the law was in place and valid when you were convicted. Therefore, you had notice of the law. You knew what the law was. You knew what the punishment would be if you killed your children, which is what he did, and you are rightfully convicted to death. An example of a no ex post facto law that would be upheld might be, let's say today I go buy Moroccan cigars, and next week the court says, the United States says, you know what, we don't want to do business with Morocco. They beat us in the Olympics, so we are now abolishing the right. You can no longer buy Moroccan cigars. Well, the United States can't come back to me and say, hey, I know you bought Moroccan cigars last week when the law wasn't in place, but it's in place now, so you go to jail or you have a fine. That would be an example of an ex post facto law. I have to know when I commit my act whether or not it's legal. This slide just outlines the Bill of Rights. I won't go through all of them. You can read them. But this outlines the Bill of Rights. And the whole point is just to remind you that in this country, personal rights and freedoms are paramount. They are paramount. But we'll see how these rights how there are limitations to what the rights are. And how the courts have interpreted and determined what the limitations shall be. The genesis really of our modern day civil rights laws, I should say, come from the Reconstruction Amendments. The Reconstruction Amendments there are three of them. First is the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. The second is the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment does a couple of things. First, it gave slaves the right to be citizens. Because before the 14th Amendment, there was a Dred Scott case that said that the slaves were not citizens. And additionally, the 14th Amendment gives states or requires states to give people all of the rights that they had under the Bill of Rights. Interestingly, and we'll see this as we go on with these slides, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states at first. So the states, remember the Anti-Federalists made such a big deal about making sure that the federal government did not trample on our rights, and we did that through the Fifth Amendment. However, the states themselves did not have to abide by those rules. So the states could trample upon your rights. And that bears out in Barron versus Baltimore, where a state, the state of Maryland, wanted to take Mr. Barron's land through eminent domain. And he said, you can't do it, Maryland. Only the federal government can do that. And as the state, you can't trample upon, you can't take my land. And Maryland said, yes, I can. It's part of the Constitution. And the court said, you know what? Mr. Barron is right. And the court said, you know what? Mr. Barron is right. Only the federal government has the right to take the land. And actually, let me just, as I'm saying it, it's coming out wrong. So let me just rephrase that again. Barron versus Baltimore essentially stands for the fact that the state of Maryland could take Mr. Barron's land, but the federal government could not. Mr. Barron was trying to make the point that, hey, there's eminent domain requires that you have to follow all these rules. And the court said, you're right, Mr. Barron. The federal government does, but the state of Maryland does not. So sorry if I confused you at first. As I was saying one thing, my mind was doing one thing, and my mouth was doing quite another. So Barron versus Baltimore, which is an 1833 case, stood for the fact that states could do what they wanted to do, but the federal government had certain rules it had to follow. The 14th Amendment eradicated that, and we'll talk about that more. And the 15th Amendment gave the slaves the right to vote. Also part of our civil rights genesis in the United States, we had the 15th Amendment extended the right to vote to slaves, which we just talked about. The 19th Amendment extended the voting right to women. The 24th Amendment prohibited poll taxes. And the 26th Amendment extended right to vote to 18-year-olds. More about the 14th Amendment. First, it was created to protect slaves. And